history has a selective memory. Wars get written into textbooks, along with the names of kings and the dates when empires crumbled overnight. Yet somewhere between all those grand narratives, we lose track of the fragile details that actually mattered. A hairpin abandoned in the mud after a hasty retreat. The faint melody of a love song that no one will ever hear again. What you're about to discover isn't another story about conquest and collapse. Instead, we're diving into the heart of one man's catastrophic choices, and how a small piece of jade became the thread that unraveled everything he had built. Chang'an stretched across the horizon like a living dream, home to over 1 million people at the height of the Tang Dynasty in the 8th century. More than just another imperial capital, the city pulsed as the very heart of the known world. Poets commanded the same respect as generals. Artists shaped culture with the stroke of a brush. And presiding over all of this unprecedented prosperity sat one extraordinary ruler, Xuanzong, known throughout his realm as the Bright Emperor. The man embodied everything his age celebrated. Military campaigns bent to his strategic genius, while his administrative reforms created a government that actually worked. When he composed music, grown men wept at the beauty. The Grand Canal became his masterpiece of engineering, carrying trade goods and ideas to every corner of his domain like arteries feeding a massive body. Under his leadership, the imperial court transformed into something unprecedented, a place where talent mattered more than bloodline. Legendary poets like Li Bai and Du Fu crafted verses in his halls that people still memorize today. Diplomats traveled from Persia and Rome just to witness what he had built, returning home with stories that sounded like fairy tales. Xuanzong had achieved something most rulers only dream about. He made power look effortless, and empire feel eternal. Yet for all his brilliance, he harbored one fatal blind spot. When you've mastered the art of ruling the world, you can forget that the hardest person to govern is often yourself. Even the most passionate fire eventually burns low. As Xuanzong aged, the daily machinery of empire began wearing him down like water on stone. Endless reports demanded his attention while ministers bickered over trivial matters, and court politics devolved into petty backstabbing. The magnificent world beyond his palace walls, everything he had sacrificed decades to build, suddenly felt hollow and meaningless. Success had become his prison. After bringing the Tang to unprecedented heights, a bone-deep exhaustion settled over him, the kind that no amount of rest could cure. The death of Empress Wang shattered something fundamental inside him. Grief opened a wound that power couldn't heal, leaving him adrift in spiritual loneliness. Slowly, deliberately, he began pulling back from the responsibilities that had once energized him. The vibrant court that had hung on his every word now felt suffocating. Beautiful gardens surrounded him, yet he saw only emptiness. Days melted into weeks as he composed increasingly somber music, each melody searching for some rhythm that might match his sorrow. The empire he had crafted ran itself now, a self-sustaining masterpiece that no longer needed its architect. Xuanzong had quietly stepped away from the controls of his own creation, and that's when fate introduced him to her. What Xuanzong witnessed that day wasn't simply beauty, but a living reminder of everything he had lost. Yang Guifei moved through the garden like poetry in motion, untouched by the calculating scheming that poisoned every other relationship in his world. Unlike the ministers who approached him with hidden agendas or generals who demanded resources, she embodied something he had nearly forgotten existed: genuine, uncomplicated grace. Her innocence felt revolutionary in a court built on manipulation and political maneuvering. For the first time in years, his heart cracked open, flooded with a longing so powerful it terrified him. In that single moment, he knew he would do anything to possess her. Yet even an emperor couldn't simply steal his own son's wife. Such an act would violate every sacred tradition, bringing shame upon his bloodline and scandal to the court. But Xuanzong had grown dangerously accustomed to bending the world to his desires. Power had taught him that obstacles were merely puzzles waiting to be solved. So he devised an intricate deception, convincing his son to surrender his wife under the pretense that she was needed as a Taoist priestess. For an entire year, Xuanzong played the role of patient ruler, all while orchestrating his elaborate plan. Then, when propriety had been satisfied, he brought her back and proclaimed her his most beloved consort. The announcement sent shockwaves through the imperial court. Ministers who had spent decades climbing the ranks of power watched in horror as a woman without noble heritage or political training suddenly commanded more influence than seasoned veterans. To them, her elevation represented clear evidence that their emperor's judgment was crumbling. But Xuanzong had become immune to criticism, deaf to the growing murmur of discontent. Rare silks, exotic perfumes, and an entire staff of servants existed solely to fulfill her wishes. She had become his entire universe, and her radiance blinded him to the gathering storm clouds. When he renamed her Yang Guifei, he believed he was simply honoring his beloved. Instead, he had just rewritten the destiny of an empire. Xuanzong had rediscovered happiness, but at a cost he refused to calculate. Love had made him reckless with the one thing that had defined his entire reign, his absolute focus on governing. While he lavished attention on Yang Guifei, he carelessly handed her relatives the keys to his empire. The brilliant administrators who had built his golden age found themselves sidelined, watching helplessly as decades of careful work unraveled under the hands of unqualified favorites. Yang Guizhong, her ambitious cousin, rose to chief minister despite possessing neither the wisdom nor competence the position demanded. The emperor, who had once rewarded merit above all else, now elevated people based on their family connections to the woman he adored. Chang'an still gleamed in the sunlight, its markets still bustled with prosperity, but something fundamental had shifted in the balance of power. Corruption spread through the Tang court like poison in the bloodstream. While Xuanzong retreated into his private paradise of poetry and romance, Yang Guifei's family descended upon the empire like locusts. The Yang clan's meteoric rise defied every principle that had made the dynasty great. Yang Guizhong, her cunning but fundamentally incompetent cousin, somehow maneuvered himself into the position of chief minister. What had once been the most prestigious appointment in the empire, reserved for the realm's finest minds, became little more than a family favor handed to an undeserving relative. Yang Guizhong transformed the imperial government into his personal money-making scheme. Official positions went to the highest bidders, while competent administrators found themselves frozen out of power. Anyone brave enough to criticize the new order faced swift retaliation. Yet the most dangerous rot wasn't happening in the halls of government, but in the hearts of the men being cast aside. Seasoned officials who had devoted their lives to serving the Tang watched in seething silence as their life's work was auctioned off to fund the extravagant whims of a woman many viewed as nothing more than a beautiful curse upon their empire. While the court indulged in banquets and whispered gossip, a far more dangerous force was consolidating power along the northern frontiers. General An Lushan represented everything the pampered Yang family was not. Where they were refined courtiers, he was a battle-hardened warrior. Where they relied on family connections, he had clawed his way up from nothing through pure determination. Born a commoner on the windswept steppes, An Lushan possessed the kind of raw charisma that inspired fierce loyalty among soldiers. Yang Guifei had developed an almost motherly fondness for this rough-edged general, while Yang Guizhong correctly recognized him as a mortal threat to the family's stranglehold on power. An Lushan had perfected the art of political theater. When the moment called for it, He could prostrate himself before Xuanzong with tears of apparent devotion, despite being powerful enough that such displays were completely unnecessary. The emperor, exhausted by the endless scheming of his silk-robed ministers, found this seemingly simple warrior refreshingly authentic. What Xuanzong failed to recognize was that An Lushan's greatest talent wasn't military strategy, but deception. Behind the humble facade burned an ambition that viewed the empire not as something to serve, but as a prize waiting to be claimed. Every romantic gesture between the emperor and Yang Guifei was catalogued in An Lushan's mind as another exploitable weakness. The hatred between Yang Guifei and An Lushan transcended mere political disagreement. Yang Guifei, poisoned by insecurity and arrogance, recognized An Lushan as an existential threat to his influence. An Lushan, meanwhile, saw Yang Guifei as the living symbol of decay, rotting the empire from within. While Yang Guifei wielded words and courtly schemes as his weapons, An Lushan commanded something far more tangible: men. Over 200,000 of them, strategically positioned across years of careful planning, all blessed by an emperor too blinded by beauty to recognize the gathering storm. Xuanzong dismissed their feuding as petty rivalry rather than the prelude to catastrophe. He couldn't have been more wrong. In the 14th year of his reign, a message reached the court that shattered everything. General An Lushan had sent word, but these weren't pledges of loyalty. They were declarations of war. He claimed rebellion not against the emperor himself, but against the corruption of Yang Guifei. He cast himself as a revolutionary, a champion of the people, riding to cleanse the court of its poison and liberate the emperor from his family's toxic grip. An Lushan understood Xuanzong's fatal weakness perfectly, and now wielded it like a blade aimed at the heart of the dynasty. The rebellion's first blow shattered the court's dreamlike existence. Xuanzong, torn from his peaceful reverie, stared at reports that seemed to describe another world entirely. He had convinced himself that his golden age possessed an eternal quality, that personal devotion could remain untouched by the machinery of power, that love itself might serve as a shield against the empire's darker forces. But An Lushan's forces swept southward like an unstoppable flood, leaving devastation in their wake. The court's armies, softened by years of luxury and riddled with corruption, collapsed before this advancing storm. As enemy forces drew closer to Chang'an, a terrible realization dawned on the emperor. The empire hadn't fallen to some distant threat, but had been hollowed out from within by a ruler who had chosen passion over wisdom, beauty over vigilance. The palace that had once felt like paradise now revealed itself as a prison of his own making. The golden age he had crafted with such care dissolved like morning mist, leaving behind only the harsh light of consequences he had refused to see. The news struck their sheltered world like lightning splitting an ancient tree. Chang'an, the eternal city that had stood as civilization's crown jewel, suddenly lay vulnerable to forces that had once seemed impossibly distant. What began as whispered rumors had erupted into a consuming blaze, transforming the bright emperor from master of the known world into just another frightened soul caught in history's merciless current. Fear swept through the court like plague. Officials who had spent years debating ceremonial details now clawed desperately for escape routes, their cultivated faces twisted by raw terror. Xuanzong, his eyes reflecting a disbelief that bordered on madness, finally understood the true scope of his catastrophic miscalculation. His love had demanded payment, and the empire was settling that debt in fire and blood. Flight became their only salvation. The imperial procession, once a magnificent display of earthly power, devolved into something approaching panic. Ornate carriages that had previously announced imperial majesty now lurched through city gates crammed with weeping concubines and ministers, clutching whatever treasures they could carry. The emperor himself, his face hollowed by fear and exhaustion, traveled in a simple palanquin, crushed beneath the weight of his crumbling dynasty. Yang Guifei huddled beside him, her celebrated beauty now ghostly with terror, transformed from the source of imperial joy into the focal point of mounting anger among their desperate companions. The journey south became their descent into hell. Roads that had once pulsed with merchant caravans and trade wealth now groaned under waves of terrified refugees, each face reflecting the empire's slow dissolution. Courtiers who had never known anything beyond silk cushions and perfumed gardens suddenly confronted the brutal world they had spent lifetimes avoiding. Hunger carved hollows in their cheeks, thirst cracked their lips, and the specter of An Lushan's approaching forces shattered whatever composure remained. The court's rigid social order, once seemingly carved in stone, began dissolving into something far more primitive, the desperate struggle to survive. Among the imperial guards, a different species of desperation was taking root. Unlike the silk-draped bureaucrats or gem-laden concubines, these were men bound by sacred oaths to protect the Tang Dynasty. They had watched their homeland convulse under chaos, born from imperial neglect and Yang family corruption. With each punishing mile, their anger toward the woman they held responsible intensified. Yang Guifei had become, in their eyes, the living symbol of the decadence that had torn their world apart. What started as whispered doubts gradually hardened into muttered accusations, and those accusations were crystallizing into something far more dangerous: cold, calculating fury. The remnants of the Imperial Guard finally dragged themselves into Mawei Inn, a crumbling way station that offered precious little sanctuary. The place provided only rough shelters, a courtyard churned into mud, and whatever meager supplies they had managed to carry. Exhaustion weighed on everyone like a physical burden, but underneath that bone-deep weariness, something far more volatile was building. The soldiers, their faces carved with grim determination, began drawing together with unmistakable purpose, their gazes repeatedly shifting toward the emperor's palanquin and the woman sheltered within. The uprising began as whispers, dangerous and low, spreading from man to man like wildfire. They spoke of squandered resources, of honor trampled underfoot, of families they had failed to shield from chaos. Soon those whispers swelled into something approaching a roar. They demanded Yang Guifei be surrendered to them. These weren't requests from subordinates to their sovereign. These were ultimatums from desperate men who had reached their breaking point. For years, they had watched this incompetent minister auction off pieces of their empire, and now he stood right there beside the emperor, breathing flesh made manifest of everything that had gone catastrophically wrong. The guards had claimed their first sacrifice, but their bloodlust remained unsatisfied. They had excised one source of corruption, yet the disease's true heart still beat within their midst. Their eyes, now glacial and unforgiving, returned to the emperor with terrible clarity. Their message needed no words, only the slow, deliberate raising of steel. They had rescued their sovereign from one enemy, and now demanded he save himself from another, or they would handle that salvation themselves. They wanted her life. Here was the man who had abandoned his throne for love, who had shattered every tradition and rational thought to possess her, who had lavished everything upon her and her family. Now, at the end of everything, the very men sworn to die for him were forcing an impossible choice. Under such crushing pressure, character doesn't simply reveal itself, it gets forged anew entirely. He had become a king without armies, a supreme ruler transformed into prisoner. He could watch her die, or die beside her. What would any of us have done? Choice had become illusion. He could only choose how to surrender. For one excruciating eternity, time itself seemed suspended. All the magnificence, all the splendor, all the passion, all the destruction, everything had collapsed into this single, unbearable moment. A poem he had once written for her surfaced in his memory, verses about love as pure as jade. Her laughter echoed in his mind, that sound which had once been his universe's only music. Yet alongside those precious memories came the haunted faces of soldiers who had lost everything. He was no longer lover, poet, or even man. Only emperor remained. Drawing a breath that seemed to tear his chest apart, he felt something ancient and terrible reawaken in his eyes, that imperial steel he had thought love had softened forever. Turning to his most trusted eunuch, he whispered an order that broke him even as he spoke it. The silence that followed possessed more weight than any cry of anguish ever could. His choice was made. The empire might survive, but what remained of the man who had saved it? He had just destroyed the one treasure he had fought hardest to preserve. His grief defied simple classification, sorrow braided with betrayal, guilt so profound it made him physically sick. He had become a survivor by murdering his own soul. The ruler who had once commanded the world with such devastating brilliance now stood with nothing but a muddy path ahead, a handful of broken men around him, and one memory so terrible it would follow him into whatever afterlife awaited failed gods. He had made his choice. In that moment of absolute despair, Emperor Xuanzong sacrificed his love for his empire's sake. But history proves a brutal and unforgiving force, one that refuses such simple calculations. His choice didn't save the empire. It merely bought him a few more years in a world he no longer recognized. And Lushan's rebellion, fueled by the very corruption those soldiers had sought to purge, continued tearing the dynasty apart. War raged for 8 more years, costing an estimated 36 million lives. An entire generation vanished. What began as petty court feuding, a lover's quarrel between a general and chief minister, had become one of history's bloodiest conflicts. The emperor, broken and grief-stricken, abdicated to his son and retreated into solitude and despair. The man who once ruled the world with such brilliance became a ghost in his own palace, haunted by the memory of a woman he'd allowed to die. His kingdom crumbled while his family scattered into exile and disgrace. The golden age he'd so carefully built turned to ash. His sacrifice meant nothing in the end. Yet, in the wake of such utter devastation, humanity did what it always does. It sought meaning in the chaos. 100 years after the war had ended, a brilliant poet named Bai Juyi took this brutal story of a lovesick emperor and his empire's collapse, then transformed it into a masterpiece. He wrote, "A song of everlasting sorrow, a poem so beautiful, so heartbreaking, that it breathed new life into the entire saga." Bai Juyi's poem told the story not of political failure, but of timeless love. He transformed a man responsible for millions of deaths into a romantic hero, and a woman who became a political scapegoat into a tragic heroine. In Bai Juyi's world, Emperor Xuanzong never chose to sacrifice his love for his empire's survival. Instead, he became a heartbroken man, a victim of circumstance, forced to part with his soulmate in a moment of pure tragedy. The poem described the emperor wandering alone for the rest of his life, his spirit forever seeking Yang Guifei's ghost in the afterlife. A beautiful lie, a magnificent fiction far easier to bear than the cold, hard truth. People wept when they heard the poem. They fell in love with star-crossed lovers. In doing so, they completely erased the reality of war and death that had come before. Why do we reach for the myth when truth cuts too deep? Perhaps because the human heart cannot bear certain kinds of knowledge without breaking. We gather the scattered fragments of our most shameful hours, the betrayals, the blood, the choices that haunt us. Then we weave them into something that glimmers with meaning. Love emerges from the wreckage of our failures. Sorrow transforms into song. The story of Emperor Xuanzong and Yang Guifei speaks to something deeper than romance or politics. It whispers of our endless need to find beauty in the ruins, to discover grace notes in the symphony of our worst mistakes. We came seeking a moment when the soul reveals itself under impossible pressure. We found it at Mawei Inn. The terrible choice between desire and duty lived in the chest of a man who had everything and lost it all. Yet the deepest truth lies not in what he chose, but in how we remember the choosing. You can witness this tale and see only political catastrophe, millions dead because one man loved unwisely. Or you might glimpse what Bai Juyi saw through the mist of centuries, two souls reaching for each other across the darkness, their love outlasting empires. Both visions exist, both are true. Which one calls to you reveals as much about your own heart as it does about theirs.